You don't remember me, do you? The judge's question stopped the courtroom cold. I stood at the defense table without a lawyer, my father's house hanging in the balance, while my uncle's attorney sat across from me with the confident smile of a man who already knew how the story would end. Then the judge looked at me again. You were in uniform that night. My throat tightened. I had no idea what she meant. And then she said the name of the town where I had been stationed years earlier. That was when my hand started shaking because I realized she wasn't asking a casual question. She remembered me, but I didn't remember her. 3 months earlier, I had thought the hardest thing I would ever do was bury my father. I was wrong. My father, Daniel Morgan, had died quietly in his sleep after a long battle with heart disease. He was 64, stubborn private, and the kind of man who fixed things himself, even when a professional could have done it faster. He had one prized possession that had never been about money. The small 2-story house where he and my mother had raised me. It sat on a tree-lined street in a quiet Ohio suburb. The paint was old. The kitchen cabinets were from the 1990s. The basement smelled faintly of sawdust because Dad had spent half his life repairing furniture down there, but it was home. My mother had died 6 years earlier. After that, Dad kept the house exactly as it was. Her blue coffee mug stayed on the second shelf. Her framed recipe cards remained beside the refrigerator. When I was deployed, he would send me photographs of that house whenever I was having a difficult week. Come home, he always wrote. I'll leave the porch light on. His will was simple. The house would go to me. Everything else was divided fairly among the family. My uncle Richard, Dad's younger brother, received some investments and personal property. He was not happy about the house. At first, I thought his anger was just grief. Then the letters started. Richard claimed my father had promised him the property years ago. He said he had paid for repairs. He said Dad had depended on him, and then through his attorney, he made a formal claim against the estate. The first time I read the complaint, I honestly thought there had been a mistake. My father had never told me Richard owned any part of the house. I called several attorneys. The first wanted a retainer I simply could not afford. The second was already booked for months. A third reviewed the basic paperwork and told me the case involved probate and property issues that could become expensive very quickly. I had savings, but most of it was tied up in my transition out of the military and my plans to repair the house. I kept searching. The court date came faster than I expected, so I walked into court alone. That morning, I wore a dark navy suit instead of my uniform. I tied my hair back and carried a folder containing every document I had managed to collect. Across the courtroom, Richard sat beside his attorney. His attorney looked polished, calm, and completely prepared. Richard looked at me and smiled. Not a warm smile, the kind of smile that said he believed I had already lost. When the hearing began, his attorney spoke first. He argued that Richard had contributed substantial money toward the property over the years, and that my father had intended to transfer the house to him. Then he produced a document, a supposed agreement signed by my father. I stared at the page. My father's name was at the bottom. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The signature looked right, almost too right. Richard's attorney turned toward me. Miss Morgan, do you have counsel representing you today? No. He nodded slowly. I see. There was something about those 2 words that made my face burn. The judge looked at me. Miss Morgan, you understand that you are representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. The judge reviewed the document. Then she looked up. Do you have evidence that contradicts this agreement? I opened my folder. I had bank statements, property tax records, copies of my father's will, emails, notes. But suddenly, sitting beneath the weight of that courtroom, everything looked inadequate. Richard's attorney had professional exhibits, legal arguments, and years of experience. I had a folder and a grieving heart. I looked across at my uncle. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked relieved. Then the judge stared at me for several seconds. Her expression changed. Miss Morgan, I looked up. You don't remember me, do you? The room seemed to disappear. I shook my head. No, Your Honor. I'm sorry, I don't. She leaned back slightly. You were in uniform that night. My pulse began pounding. What night? She named a town, then a high, then a storm. I knew the place. I knew the night, but I still didn't know her. The judge glanced down at the file, then back at me. I need to make a disclosure before we continue. Richard's attorney immediately sat straighter. The judge explained that she had encountered me years earlier under circumstances unrelated to the current case. She said she could not allow that prior connection to affect the proceeding. Then she made a decision I never expected. She recused herself. Richard's confident expression disappeared. The judge stood. Before leaving the bench, she looked directly at me. There is something in this record that deserves a closer look. Then she was gone. I stood there frozen. I had entered that courtroom, believing I was about to lose my father's house. I left the courtroom with no victory, no lawyer, and no idea why a judge from years ago remembered me. But for the first time since Richard filed that lawsuit, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't walking toward the end of my father's story. I was walking toward the beginning of a truth he had never had the chance to tell me. The town the judge had named was Dayton, Ohio. The highway was Route 35, and the storm had happened 7 years earlier, during one of the worst nights of rain I could remember. Back then, I was still in the Army. I had been driving home from a training assignment when the rain became so heavy that headlights looked like blurred stars. Traffic slowed to almost nothing. Water ran across the highway, and thunder shook the windows of my car. Then I saw the wreck. A sedan had spun across 2 lanes and struck the concrete barrier. Its front end was crushed. Another vehicle had stopped behind it, hazard lights flashing. I pulled over. I remember grabbing my phone, calling 911, and running through the rain. There was a woman inside the sedan. She was conscious but trapped. "Please," she kept saying. "Please don't leave me." "I'm not leaving," I told her. I crawled close enough to reach her hand through the broken window. She was terrified. I remember talking to her about ordinary things because I knew panic could make a bad situation worse. I asked her where she lived. She told me. I asked if she had children. She said yes. I told her to keep breathing. Eventually, emergency crews arrived. Firefighters cut through the door, paramedics stabilized her, and police began controlling traffic. Before they took her away, she looked at me. "What's your name, Claire?" "Claire? What?" I smiled. "Just Claire?" She laughed weakly. Then the ambulance doors closed. I never saw her again. At least I thought I never did. Now, sitting in my car outside the courthouse 7 years later, I remembered her face. And suddenly, I remembered the judge. She had not been a judge that night. She had been the woman trapped in the car. Her name was Evelyn Carter. After the hearing, I sat in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel. My phone buzzed. It was my uncle. "Hope you enjoyed your little courtroom performance." I didn't answer. Another message appeared. "You should settle while you still can." I turned the phone face down. For the first time, I understood something important. Richard wasn't worried about losing. He was worried about what might happen if I kept looking. The case was reassigned to another judge. Several days later, Richard's attorney sent another letter demanding that I agree to a settlement. The offer was insulting. He wanted me to give up the house in exchange for a small payment and a promise that neither side would pursue further claims. I read it twice. Then I remembered my father's handwriting. "Come home. I'll leave the porch light on." I wrote back that I would not agree. The next morning, I began doing what I had learned to do in the military whenever a situation became confusing. I made a timeline. I wrote down every date I could verify. My father bought the house in 1998. My mother died in 2020. Dad updated his will in 2021. Richard claimed he had paid for major repairs beginning in 2019. But the bank records I had showed something different. Dad had paid the contractors himself. I spread the documents across the dining room table. Receipts, bank statements, property tax bills, insurance records, emails. Then I found something that made me stop. Richard claimed he had paid for a new roof in 2019. But one of the checks had been written from my father's account. I checked another and another. Nearly every expense Richard claimed as his own had actually been paid by Dad. I leaned back in my chair. Why would you lie about this? The house was silent. Then I noticed something else. The disputed agreement Richard's attorney had presented in court was dated March 14th, 2021. I knew that date. My father had been in the hospital that week. He had suffered a cardiac episode and spent 4 days there. I pulled out his medical records. March 14th. Hospitalized, not at home, not signing property agreements, not meeting with Richard. I stared at the date again. My hands went cold. I called the attorney who had previously told me he couldn't take my case. He agreed to speak with me for a few minutes. When I explained what I had found, his tone changed. "Do you have the original document?" "No, only a copy." "Then get the original if you can, and don't accuse anyone of forgery yet." "Why?" "Because if you're right, the evidence will speak for itself." That sentence stayed with me. The next day, I contacted a local legal aid organization and explained my situation. They couldn't take over the entire case, but an attorney agreed to review some of the documents and explain what I should be looking for. She studied the disputed agreement, then she pointed to the signature. "Your father normally signed his name like this?" "Yes." She compared it with older documents. "It's similar." My heart sank, but she continued. "Similar isn't the same as authentic." She pointed to the date. "Your father's medical records may matter a lot here." I nodded. Then she asked, "Who witnessed this?" I looked at the document. A name was listed, Margaret Lewis. I knew that name too. Margaret had worked for Richard's company years ago. The attorney looked at me. "Find her." That night, I searched through old emails and public records. I found an address. I wasn't sure what I would discover when I knocked on that door, but I knew one thing. My father had spent his final years believing he had protected his home for me. I was going to find out exactly what Richard was trying to take from me, and why he was so confident that I would never uncover the truth. Margaret Lewis lived in a small ranch house about 20 minutes outside Columbus. I sat in my car across the street for almost 5 minutes before I finally worked up the courage to knock. I wasn't afraid of Margaret. I was afraid of what she might say. If she confirmed that the document was real, I could lose my father's house. If she said it was false, I would have to prove it. Either way, the truth was going to hurt. I knocked. A woman in her late 60s opened the door. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she wore a sweatshirt and reading glasses. "Can I help you?" "Are you Margaret Lewis?" Her expression changed. "Yes, my name is Claire Morgan. I'm Daniel Morgan's daughter." She stared at me. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she opened the door a little wider. "Come in." Her living room was modest and comfortable. Family photographs covered one wall. She offered me coffee, but I declined. I placed a copy of the disputed agreement on the table. Margaret didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at me. "Where did you get this?" "My uncle's attorney submitted it in court." Her face went pale. I was afraid of that. My heart began pounding. "You recognize it?" She nodded slowly. "I recognize my name." I waited. She took off her glasses. "Claire, I never witnessed your father signing this document." The room seemed to tilt. "Then why is your name on it?" "I don't know." "You signed something?" "Yes." "What?" "A document Richard brought to me at work. He told me it was related to some business paperwork. I didn't read every page." My voice became quieter. "Was my father there?" "No." "Did you see him sign anything?" "No." I stared at the document. "Then why would you sign as a witness?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "Because I trusted Richard." That sentence sounded painfully familiar. I thought about my father. He had trusted his brother, too. Margaret told me that she had left Richard's company a few months later. She had no idea the document would ever be used in a property dispute. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Richard asked me not to talk about it." "Why?" "He said it would only create problems." I looked at her. "Problems for who?" She didn't answer. I took a breath. Margaret, my father, was in the hospital on the date shown on this document. Her eyes widened. "Then it couldn't have happened the way this says." "That's what I believe." She leaned back. "I have something." She stood and walked into a hallway. A few minutes later, she returned with an old cardboard box. Inside were notebooks, tax documents, photographs, and several envelopes. She searched through them carefully. Then she pulled out a small black notebook. "I used to write down everything related to work, dates, meetings, appointments." She opened it. Her finger stopped on a page. "March 14th, 2021. I leaned forward. "What does it say?" She turned the notebooks toward me. Written in blue ink were the words "Office closed early. Richard left around 3 and grow. No meeting with Daniel." I stared at the page. That was the same day. Yes, I felt tears burn behind my eyes. For the first time, I had something more than suspicion. I had a witness. I asked if she would be willing to speak with my attorney. Margaret hesitated. Then she nodded. Yes. Before I left, she looked at me. I'm sorry, Claire. I stood. For what? For not asking questions sooner. I didn't know what to say. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those words. Not asking questions sooner. Maybe that was how family betrayals happened. Not in one dramatic moment, but through years of silence, assumptions, and people convincing themselves that something wasn't their problem. When I arrived home, there was a message from Richard. Stop digging. That was all it said. I stared at the screen. Then I deleted nothing. I saved the message. The next morning, I contacted the legal aid attorney and told her what Margaret had said. She asked me to bring everything in. She reviewed the notebook, the medical records, and the disputed agreement. This is significant, she said. Can we prove the document is fake? Not yet. My disappointment must have shown, she continued. But we may be able to show that it could not have been executed when they claim it was. She explained that the next step would be authentication. We needed records showing where my father was that day, where the notary was, and whether Margaret actually witnessed anything. I nodded. Then let's find those records. She smiled slightly. You're learning what that court isn't about who tells the most convincing story. It's about who can prove what they say. That afternoon, I requested additional property records. One document immediately caught my attention. The disputed agreement had supposedly been notarized by a man named Thomas Bell. I searched his name. He was still a licensed notary in Ohio. I contacted his office. He refused to discuss the matter without proper authorization, but he agreed to preserve his records if they were requested through the appropriate legal process. I passed that information to the attorney. 2 days later, she called me. Claire, we found something. What? The notary journal. My heart started racing. What about it? The journal doesn't match your uncle's document. I sat down. What does that mean? It means we need to look much more closely at how this agreement was created. She paused. There is something else. What? The witness signature. I held my breath. The signature on the document may not match Margaret's original signature from the same period. I closed my eyes. For the first time, I could see a path through the darkness. But then my uncle's attorney filed another motion. This time, he argued that I was harassing family members and attempting to manufacture evidence. Richard wanted the court to dismiss my objections. He wanted the house, and he was becoming desperate. At the hearing, his attorney looked directly at me. You're chasing ghosts, Ms. Morgan. I said nothing. Richard leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. The attorney smiled. Then he looked at me again. You're going to have to prove all of this. I looked down at my father's folder. For the first time, I smiled, because I finally understood something. I didn't need to convince them. I needed to prove it. And somewhere inside a notary's old journal was the piece of truth my uncle had forgotten to erase. The notary journal changed everything. 2 days after my attorney reviewed it, she called me and asked me to come to her office. When I arrived, she had several documents spread across her desk. Claire, she said, the agreement your uncle submitted says your father signed it on March 14th, 2021. I know the notary's journal shows notarization that day. I stared at her. So the document is fake. Careful, she said. We can say the document is inconsistent with the notary's official records. That's different from proving who created it. I nodded. She continued, there's more. She handed me a photocopy. It was a page from the notary's journal. The entries around March 14th were clear. No Daniel Morgan, no property transfer, no signature matching the agreement. But there was something else. The notary had recorded that his office was closed that afternoon because of a family emergency. The supposed agreement had been notarized at 4:15 p.m. That was impossible. I sat back in the chair. My father had been in the hospital. The witness hadn't seen him sign. The notary's own records showed the notarization could not have happened, and yet Richard had presented that document in court as if it were legitimate. I felt anger rising inside me. My attorney noticed. Don't confront your uncle. Why? Because right now you have something better than an argument. You have evidence. I took a slow breath. She was right. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the person who had done this. Richard wasn't some stranger. He was my father's younger brother. He had eaten at our kitchen table. He had helped Dad repair the fence after my mother died. He had stood beside me at my mother's funeral. How could someone who had shared so many family memories become this person trying to steal my father's last gift to me? That evening, I went back to my father's house. I opened every drawer in his office. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for context. My father had always been organized. He kept receipts in labeled folders and wrote notes in old spiral notebooks. After several hours, I found a locked metal box beneath a stack of tax records. I knew the box. Dad had owned it for years. I found the key taped beneath the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were photographs, old bank statements, insurance papers, and several handwritten letters. At the very bottom was an envelope with my name on it, Claire. My hands began trembling before I even opened it. Dad's handwriting was unmistakable. My girl, if you're reading this, something has happened that I hoped would never happen. I stopped. I had to put the letter down for a moment. Then I continued. I know your uncle has asked about the house. I have told him no more than once. My eyes moved quickly across the page. Richard believes I owe him because he helped me during difficult years. He did help me. I will always acknowledge that. But helping someone does not give them ownership of what belongs to someone else. I swallowed hard. Then I read the sentence that broke my heart. Your mother wanted this house to remain a place where our family could always come home. I looked around the room. Her photographs were still on the wall. Her old sewing machine still sat beside the window. Dad had kept everything. The letter continued. If Richard ever challenges the will, don't fight him because you hate him. Fight him because I made a promise to your mother. I pressed the letter against my chest. For years, I had thought my father simply wanted me to inherit a house. Now I understood. He wanted me to protect a memory. There was one more item in the box, a small USB drive. I stared at it. My father had never been particularly comfortable with technology. He still printed emails. Why would he leave me a USB drive? I took it to my laptop. There were only 3 files. The first contained photographs of the house. The second was a scanned copy of an older version of his will. The third was an audio recording. I clicked it. Static filled the room. Then I heard my father's voice. If you're hearing this, Claire, I'm sorry. I froze. His voice sounded tired. Older than I remembered. I didn't want to involve you in this. There was a pause. Then another voice entered the recording. Richard, my uncle. I recognized him immediately. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Daniel. Dad answered, No, I'm making it clear. You don't need that house anymore. I don't need it. Claire does. Richard laughed. You're going to leave everything to a daughter who barely comes home. My chest tightened. Dad's voice became firm. She serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment. Silence. Then Richard said something that made my entire body go cold. What if she doesn't come back? My father answered immediately. Then the house stays hers anyway. The recording continued for several minutes. Richard begged. He argued. He said he was in financial trouble. He said the house could save his business. Dad refused. Finally, my father said, If anything happens to me, Claire gets the house. There will be no confusion. The recording ended. I sat alone in the dark. I didn't cry immediately. Instead, I listened to it again and again. Then I understood why Richard had become so desperate. He wasn't simply trying to inherit something. He was trying to erase my father's final decision. The next morning, I gave the recording to my attorney. She listened carefully. This could be very important, she said. Can we use it? We'll need to establish when it was made and authenticate the voices. But yes, it may help. I nodded. Then she looked at me. There is something else we need to discuss. What your uncle may have known about this recording. I felt a chill because, if he knew your father documented the conversation, he would have a reason to create another document that appeared to override the will. I stared at her. So, the fake agreement may have been created to contradict your father's actual wishes. The pieces were finally beginning to fit, but there was still one question. Why had the original judge recognized me? That afternoon, I received a formal notice from the court. It concerned Judge Evelyn Carter, the woman who had recused herself. She had disclosed our prior encounter, and provided the court with the emergency report from 7 years earlier. I read it carefully. Then I saw something I had forgotten. The report listed another person at the accident scene, Richard Morgan, my uncle. I stared at the name. Why had Richard been there that night? And why had the judge remembered me, but not mentioned him? I called my attorney. "I think there's something you're missing," I said. She was silent for a moment. "What did you find?" "My uncle was at that accident scene." Another pause. "Claire," she said quietly. "Then we need to find out exactly why." I looked at my father's letter sitting on the desk. For the first time, I understood that the courtroom battle might not have begun with the house. The house might have been the last piece of a much older story, and I was finally getting close enough to see it. The hearing began at 9:30 on a gray Tuesday morning. By then, I had stopped feeling afraid. Not because I was confident, because I finally understood what my father had taught me without ever saying it directly. When the truth is on your side, you don't have to make it louder. You just have to make it impossible to ignore. I walked into the courthouse, carrying the same brown folder I had carried weeks earlier, but this time it was thicker. Inside were copies of my father's will, his medical records, bank statements, property records, Margaret's statement, the notary records, and the audio recording of my father and Richard. My attorney sat beside me. She wasn't representing me for free, and she couldn't take over every aspect of the case, but she had agreed to assist me with the most complicated legal issues. For the first time, I wasn't completely alone. Across the aisle, Richard sat beside his attorney. His lawyer looked confident. Richard didn't. He kept staring at the folder in my hands. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. Richard's attorney argued first. He claimed the disputed agreement demonstrated my father's intent to transfer the property to Richard. He described my objections as the actions of a grieving daughter who had misunderstood her father's financial arrangements. Then he said something that made my jaw tighten. "Your Honor, Ms. Morgan appears determined to turn a simple property dispute into an accusation against her own family." I looked down. My attorney leaned toward me. "Don't react." I nodded. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Morgan, you may respond." I stood. "My objection isn't based on what I believe my father wanted. It's based on what the documents show." I handed the clerk the first exhibit. My father's medical records show he was hospitalized on the date this agreement was supposedly signed. Richard shifted in his chair. His attorney objected. The judge reviewed the records. "Objection noted. Continue." I handed over the next document. The notary's official journal shows that the notarization listed on this agreement did not occur. Richard's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, we dispute the interpretation of that record." The judge looked at him. Then you may explain the discrepancy." He paused. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his face. My attorney submitted the relevant page from the notary's journal. The entry showed that the notary's office had been closed that afternoon. The supposed notarization was listed at 4:15 p.m. The attorney had no immediate answer. Then Margaret took the stand. I watched her walk slowly to the witness chair. She looked nervous, but she didn't look away. She confirmed that Richard had given her paperwork to sign years earlier. She confirmed that she never saw my father sign the disputed agreement. She confirmed that she had never met my father that day. Then the attorney asked her a question. "Ms. Lewis, are you certain the signature on this document is yours?" Margaret looked at the paper. "Yes," he smiled. For a moment, I thought he had found a weakness. Then Margaret continued, "But I did not sign it as a witness to Daniel Morgan's signature." The smile disappeared. The attorney tried another question. "Isn't it possible that you simply don't remember?" Margaret looked directly at him. "I may forget where I left my glasses. I don't forget witnessing a man sign away his house." A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. The judge asked for the notary records. The clerk presented them. The evidence was becoming difficult to explain. Then my attorney stood. "We have one additional exhibit." She submitted the audio recording. Richard's face changed. I knew he recognized it. The recording was played in open court. My father's voice filled the room. "If anything happens to me, Claire gets the house. There will be no confusion." Then Richard's voice. "You're going to leave everything to a daughter who barely comes home. And my father's answer, she serves this country. Don't mistake distance for abandonment. I looked at Richard. He was staring at the floor. When the recording ended, the courtroom remained silent. Richard's attorney stood slowly. Your Honor, we would request time to challenge the authenticity of this recording. The judge agreed that authentication would be required. My attorney was prepared. The original device containing the recording had been preserved. The file metadata, along with testimony regarding where it came from, could be examined properly. There would be no shortcuts, no dramatic accusation, just evidence. Then something unexpected happened. The judge asked Richard directly whether he disputed that the voices belonged to him and Daniel. Richard's attorney leaned toward him. Richard swallowed. No, he said quietly. The courtroom went silent again. The judge looked at him. Mr. Morgan, are you saying you do not dispute the conversation occurred? Richard closed his eyes. No. His attorney looked at him sharply. Richard continued. I just didn't think she'd find it. My heart sank. Not because I had won, because I finally understood how far he had gone. The judge asked for clarification. Richard's attorney immediately requested a recess. During the break, Richard approached me in the hallway. His face looked older than it had that morning. You don't understand, he whispered. I understand enough. I was going to lose everything. You were trying to take Dad's house. I thought he owed me. He didn't. Richard looked away. I helped him and he thanked you. That wasn't enough. His voice cracked. I realized then that his greed wasn't really about the house. It was about resentment. For years, Richard had believed my father had received the better life. He saw the house as proof that Daniel had always chosen me over him. But my father hadn't chosen between brothers. He had simply made a decision about his own property. The hearing resumed. Richard's attorney no longer smiled. He asked for additional time to review the evidence. The judge granted a limited continuance for proper authentication and review. Several weeks later, the final hearing took place. The notary confirmed that his journal contained no record of the alleged transaction. Margaret confirmed her testimony. The medical records established my father's hospitalization. The audio recording was authenticated, and the property records showed that Richard had not made the payments he claimed. One piece at a time, the stores Richard had built collapsed. Finally, the judge ruled. The disputed agreement was rejected. Richard's claim to the house was denied. The house remained with my father's estate, and under the valid will, it passed to me. I sat perfectly still. I didn't cheer, I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes. My father had won. Not because I had defeated Richard, because the truth had survived him. Outside the courthouse, Richard stopped me. I'm sorry, he said. I looked at him. He was crying. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, I said it doesn't. He nodded. Then he asked the question I never expected. Can I see the house one more time? I looked at him for a long moment, and I realized that winning the case had been the easy part. What I chose to do with the victory would tell me who I really was. I looked at my uncle standing outside the courthouse. For months I had imagined this moment. I had imagined him angry. I had imagined myself telling him exactly what I thought of him. I had imagined walking away while he finally understood what it felt like to lose. But when he stood there with tears in his eyes, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Can I see the house one more time? He asked. I took a breath. Yes, we drove separately. When I unlocked the front door, Richard stopped behind me. He didn't walk inside immediately. He just stared at the hallway. Your dad painted that himself, he said. I know. He smiled faintly. He hated that color. I almost laughed. He chose it. I know, Richard said. That's why I used to tease him about it. We walked through the living room. Everything looked exactly as it had before the lawsuit. My mother's photographs still sat on the mantel. My father's old recliner was beside the window. His tools were still organized in the basement. Richard stood in front of one photograph. It showed my father and Richard as young men, standing beside their first car. They looked happy. I had seen that picture 100 times. But that day, I saw something different. Two brothers who had once loved each other before money, pride, and resentment had gotten in the way. Richard touched the edge of the frame. He was always better at everything. I looked at him. That isn't true. It felt true. He sat down. When your dad bought this house, I was struggling. When he started his business, I was still trying to figure out mine. When Mom died, he was the one everyone depended on. He looked toward me, and then you came home wearing that uniform. And he looked at you, like you were the greatest thing he'd ever done. I didn't answer. Richard wiped his eyes. I thought this house was the last thing I could take from him. That wasn't the house talking, I said. That was your anger. He nodded. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I lied. I looked at him. I know. No, I mean about everything. He admitted that he had exaggerated how much money he had contributed to the property. He had convinced himself that because he had helped Dad several times, he deserved the house. When Dad refused, Richard became bitter. He said he had pressured someone connected to his business to help prepare paperwork that could make his claim appear stronger. He did not try to excuse it. He knew there could still be consequences for what he had done. I listened quietly. Part of me wanted to tell him that he deserved every consequence coming his way. Another part remembered my father's voice. Don't fight him because you hate him. My father had never asked me to protect Richard from consequences. He had asked me not to become cruel. Richard, I said, I can't pretend this didn't happen. I know you hurt me. I know you tried to take the last thing Dad left me. He looked down. I know, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you. He looked up. That was the first time I saw genuine relief in his face. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just the possibility of it. I told him that forgiveness would require accountability. He would have to cooperate with any legal process involving the false document. He agreed. He also agreed to repay legitimate debts and stop making claims against the estate. We didn't hug. It wasn't that kind of moment. Some wounds need time before they can be touched. But when he left, he paused at the front door. Your dad would be proud of you. I looked at the porch light, the same light he used to leave on whenever I was away. I hope so. After Richard left, I stood alone in the kitchen. For the first time, the house didn't feel like evidence. It felt like home. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Judge Evelyn Carter. It wasn't about the case. It contained no legal advice. She simply wrote about the night we met. She told me that after the accident, she remembered being terrified and hearing a young woman tell her over and over, I'm not leaving. She hadn't known my last name. She hadn't known where I lived. She hadn't known whether she would ever see me again. But she remembered my face. She wrote that she had never forgotten what it felt like to be helpless and have a stranger refuse to leave. Then she explained something that stayed with me. When she recognized me in court, she immediately knew she could not continue as the judge because of our prior connection. She had recused herself because justice had to be fair to both sides. She had not helped me win. She had simply recognized me. That distinction mattered. I folded the letter and placed it beside my father's. Two people from different moments in my life had reminded me of the same lesson. Character isn't what you do when everyone is watching. It's what you do when nobody can reward you for doing the right thing. I eventually repaired the house. I kept my mother's blue coffee mug. I kept Dad's workbench. I even kept the ugly paint color he had loved. But I made one change. I put a small table on the front porch. It became the place where family members could sit, talk, and remember that the house had never really been about money. It was about belonging. I also learned something practical from the lawsuit. If you have a will, keep it current. Keep property records, beneficiary information, financial documents, and important communications organized. Don't assume family members will automatically agree after you're gone. And if you become involved in a civil or probate dispute, don't wait until the last minute to seek qualified legal help. If you cannot afford private counsel, look for local legal aid organizations, bar association referral services, or other legitimate resources in your area. Representing yourself may be possible in many civil matters, but complicated property and probate disputes can become overwhelming very quickly. I learned that the hard way. I walked into court without a lawyer, thinking that meant I had no chance. It didn't, but I also learned that courage doesn't mean refusing help. Sometimes courage means admitting you need it. And revenge. I thought I wanted revenge. I thought I wanted Richard to feel the same pain he had caused me. But when everything was over, I realized revenge would have given me another victory to celebrate. Justice gave me something better. It gave me the truth. And forgiveness gave me the chance to stop carrying the weight of what my uncle had done. I still remember that courtroom. I remember sitting alone. I remember his attorney smiling. I remember thinking I was about to lose everything. And most of all, I remember the judge looking at me and asking, "You don't remember me, do you?" For years, I thought that question changed my life because she recognized me. Now I know it changed my life because it reminded me who I wanted to be. My father didn't leave me a house so I could win a war against my family. He left it to me because he trusted me to protect what mattered without destroying myself in the process. And maybe that's the greatest inheritance any parent can leave. Not money, not property, but a lesson about who you should become when life gives you every reason to become bitter. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, take a moment to think about what you would protect, what you would forgive, and what you would never compromise. And if you believe someone else could use that reminder today, share this story with them. If you enjoy stories about courage, family justice, and second chances, consider subscribing and staying with us for the next one. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't making someone pay. Sometimes it's walking away with your heart still intact. The first thing my father-in-law did after his son's funeral was swing a hammer at my front door. I was standing 6 feet away when the lock gave a sharp metallic crack. Richard Hale looked at me through the broken doorway and said, "You have 5 minutes to get out of my son's house." I didn't move. His son Mark stood behind him, with a phone raised recording everything. Richard smiled. That was when I realized something neither of them knew. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. 5 minutes later, everything changed. My husband Daniel had been dead for 4 days, 49 years old, a sudden heart attack. 1 minute he was complaining about the coffee at breakfast. And by evening I was sitting beside a hospital bed, listening to a doctor explain that there was nothing more they could do. Daniel was my husband for 22 years. He was also the only person in his family who never treated me like I needed to earn my place. His father was different. Richard had never liked me. From the beginning he thought I was too quiet, too ordinary, too soft. He liked women who spoke loudly, dressed expensively, and made sure everyone knew what they had accomplished. I preferred old jeans, gardening gloves, and a quiet morning. So, Richard decided he knew exactly who I was. A housewife, a woman who depended on her husband, a woman who would fold the moment life became difficult. He had no idea how wrong he was. What Richard also didn't know was that I had spent 20 years learning how to read a room before anyone else noticed the danger inside it. I had learned to recognize the difference between confidence and bluffing, between a threat and an empty performance. After leaving the service, I buried that part of myself so deeply that even Daniel knew only the broadest outline of my past. He knew I had served. He never knew what I had done, where I had gone, or why I sometimes woke before dawn and checked every window before making coffee. I never wanted that life to follow me home. After Daniel's funeral, I barely slept. The house felt strangely large without him. His coffee mug was still beside the kitchen sink. His reading glasses sat on the end table. A pair of work boots remained by the garage door because he had promised he would clean them that weekend. I kept thinking there would be a weekend. There wasn't. On the 4th afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through Daniel's medical bills, when I heard a vehicle stop outside. I looked through the window. Richard was getting out of a black pickup. Mark climbed out on the passenger side. I immediately felt something was wrong. Neither man was dressed for a visit. Richard walked toward my front door, carrying a hammer. I stood Richard. He didn't answer. He raised the hammer and struck the lock. The sound echoed through the hallway. I froze. He hit it again. "Stop!" I shouted. He hit it a third time. The lock broke. The door swung inward. Mark stepped inside behind him, still holding his phone. Richard looked around my living room as if he had already purchased it. "Dad!" Mark said quietly. "Just keep calm." I almost laughed. They were the ones who had broken into my house, yet they were telling each other to stay calm. Richard pointed at me. "This is family property now." "No," I said, "it isn't." His expression hardened. "My son is dead, I know, and everything he owned belongs to his family. I was his wife." You were his wife, Richard snapped, past tense. Mark slowly moved his phone toward me. Just cooperate, Claire. I looked at the screen. He was recording me. Why are you recording? In case you cause a scene. I looked at the broken lock, then at the hammer in Richard's hand, then back at Mark. You broke into my home. Richard stepped closer. Don't play games with me, I'm not. You've had 4 days to grieve, that's enough. Something inside me went completely still. Not angry, not frightened, still. I had learned a long time ago that anger makes people careless. Richard mistook my silence for surrender. He pointed toward the hallway. We're looking for Daniel's documents. The deed, insurance papers, bank information, anything related to his estate. You don't have permission to search my home. This is my son's house. No, I said quietly, it isn't. Richard laughed. You really think you can stop me? I looked directly into his eyes. Yes. That answer changed his expression for half a second. Then he recovered. You're alone now, Claire. I heard that sentence differently than he intended. Alone. He thought it meant helpless. I knew better. Mark walked toward the office. I stepped in front of him. Don't. He stopped. Richard raised his voice. Move. For the first time, there was something in my voice he didn't recognize. Not fear, not grief, command. Richard took another step. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I almost smiled. That was exactly what I had been thinking about him. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:17 p.m. Fine, I said. Take whatever you think belongs to you. Mark looked surprised. Richard smiled triumphantly, but I wasn't looking at either of them. I was looking at the front window. At 2:18, a dark sedan pulled up beside the curb. Richard turned. A man in his 60s stepped out. He looked at the broken lock, then at me. His face changed. Claire, he said. Richard frowned. How do you know her? The man ignored him. He looked at me and asked quietly, Are you ready? I nodded. Richard's smile disappeared. Ready for what? I finally looked at him. For you to find out who you broke that door for. The room went silent, and for the first time since Daniel died, I felt something other than grief. I felt prepared. The man standing in my driveway was named Thomas Reed. To Richard, he was a stranger. To me, he was one of the few people left in the world who knew the woman I had been before I became Daniel's wife. Thomas didn't step inside. He simply stood beside the broken door and looked at Richard. You need to leave, he said. Richard stared at him. This is a family matter. Thomas glanced at the hammer still hanging from Richard's hand. No, breaking into a widow's home with a hammer makes it a legal matter. Mark lowered his phone. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Richard pointed at me. She has no right to keep my son's property from me. Thomas looked at me. Do you want me to stay? I nodded. He stayed. Richard finally backed toward the door, but not before leaning close enough for me to hear him whisper, You'll regret humiliating me. I looked at the broken lock. You did that yourself. He left. Mark followed. I watched their truck disappear down the street. Only then did I let myself breathe. Thomas closed the door as much as the damaged frame allowed. You okay? I'm fine. He gave me the look he used to give me years ago whenever I said those words after something had gone badly. You've always hated that question. I still do. I know. He looked around the house. Daniel, I swallowed. Gone. Thomas lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. Thank you. We stood there quietly. Then he asked, How much does Richard know about me? Yes. Almost nothing. That may be about to change. I sat down at the kitchen table. I never wanted Daniel's family to know. Thomas pulled out a chair. Why? Because I wanted to be Claire. He waited. I looked toward the hallway where Daniel's jacket still hung on a hook. Not a title, not a reputation, not a story people told about me. Just Claire. Thomas nodded. I understand. Most people didn't. For 20 years I had lived a life that required constant vigilance. After I left the Navy, I wanted the opposite. I wanted grocery lists and school concerts. I wanted a husband who complained when I left the lights on. I wanted a garden that died every summer, because I never remembered to water it enough. I wanted ordinary, and Daniel gave me that. When we met, I told him I had served in the Navy. That was enough. He knew I had spent years away from home. He knew some assignments had been dangerous. He knew there were things I couldn't discuss. He never pushed. That was one of the reasons I loved him. Richard, however, had always interpreted my quietness differently. He mistook restraint for insecurity. I remembered the first Thanksgiving I spent with the Hale family. Richard had looked at the casserole I brought and said, "Daniel always had expensive taste. I suppose marriage changes that." Everyone laughed. I smiled. Daniel didn't. Later he found me washing dishes. "You don't have to put up with him," he said. "He's your father. That doesn't make him right." I dried a plate. "Let him think whatever he wants." Daniel kissed my forehead. "You're stronger than you realize." I never told him how strange that sentence sounded coming from him, because I knew exactly how strong I was. I just didn't need anyone else to know. After Thomas left that afternoon, I began going through Daniel's belongings. Not because Richard had demanded it, because I needed to understand what had happened. Daniel had always been organized. His files were labeled. His tax returns were neatly stored. Insurance documents were in a blue folder inside the office cabinet. But when I opened that cabinet, I noticed something immediately. One folder was missing. The estate folder. I searched the desk. Nothing. The safe. Nothing. The filing cabinet. Nothing. I called Daniel's attorney. Her name was Susan Miller. She answered on the second ring. "Claire, Susan, did Daniel ever discuss his estate with you?" There was a pause. "Yes." "Did he change anything recently?" Another pause. "Why are you asking?" "Because my father-in-law just broke into my house with a hammer." Silence. Then Susan said very carefully, "Claire, I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning." "Why?" "I can't discuss it over the phone." My stomach tightened. "Is there something wrong?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," she sighed. "Bring your driver's license, and don't give anyone access to Daniel's office until we speak." I looked at the damaged front door. "It's a little late for that." "Then change the locks tonight." "I will." "And Claire, yes, do not sign any Richard gives you." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. The next morning I drove to Susan's office. On the way, I passed the diner where Daniel and I used to have breakfast on Saturday mornings. I almost kept driving. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot. I ordered his usual breakfast out of habit: eggs, toast, black coffee. Then I sat alone in the booth by the window. For the first time since his death, I allowed myself to cry. Not because Richard had broken my lock, not because he wanted the house, because Daniel would never sit across from me again and complain that the toast was burnt. I wiped my eyes. Then I remembered his last words to me. They had been ordinary. "See you tonight," I had said. "Don't forget the groceries." He smiled. "I won't." He never came home. I drove to Susan's office with tears still drying on my face. She closed the door behind me. Then she placed a thick folder on her desk. "This is what Daniel left behind." I stared at it. "What is it?" Susan looked directly at me. "Evidence that your husband knew his father was coming for this house." My heart stopped. Daniel knew. He suspected. She opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank statements, property records, emails, and handwritten notes. One note had Daniel's handwriting. 3 words were underlined twice. "Dad cannot be trusted." I read them again. Then Susan turned another page. "There's more." "What?" Daniel was investigating transfers from an account his father controlled. I felt the room grow colder. "How much?" Susan hesitated, enough to explain why Richard is desperate. I looked down at the documents. Suddenly, the broken lock wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the moment Richard realized his plan was already falling apart, and I had a feeling Daniel had known that long before he died. Susan slid the first bank statement across the desk. I looked at the numbers, but for a moment they didn't mean anything. Then I saw the dates. "These transfers started 3 years ago," I said. Susan nodded. "Daniel discovered them about 6 months ago. Why didn't he tell me he was trying to handle it himself?" That sounded exactly like Daniel. He had spent most of our marriage believing he could protect the people he loved by carrying difficult things alone. I hated that about him. I understood it too. Susan turned another page. "These payments went from an account controlled by Richard into a company called Hale Property Management." I frowned. "That sounds like his business." "It is. And why would Daniel care?" "Because some of the money came from an account that wasn't Richard's." I looked up. "Who's your mother-in-law's estate?" I felt a chill move through me. Richard's wife Eleanor had died 7 years earlier. She had left behind a modest inheritance that was supposed to be divided between Daniel and Mark. Daniel received his share according to the estate records. Yes. Then, where did this money come from? Susan tapped the page. That's what Daniel was trying to find out. I leaned back. For years, I had believed Richard was simply controlling, difficult, proud. The kind of father who thought his adult children should still ask permission before making decisions. But this was different. This was deliberate. How much? Susan turned another page. Just under $300,000. I stared at her. $300,000 over several transactions. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. I had spent years lecturing Daniel about responsibility, hard work, and family loyalty. And all along he had been moving money that didn't belong to him. What does this have to do with my house? Susan folded her hands. Daniel believed Richard was trying to create financial pressure on him. He thought if he could convince Daniel to sell this property, he could gain access to the equity. I looked down at the paperwork. The house wasn't extravagant. It was a 3-bedroom home in a quiet Virginia neighborhood. Daniel and I had bought it years ago when prices were still reasonable. We had paid the mortgage every month, repaired the roof, replaced the furnace, and slowly made the place ours. It wasn't just a house. It was where Daniel and I had built our life. Susan handed me another document. This is the part you need to understand. It was a property agreement. Daniel's signature appeared at the bottom. I recognized it immediately. What is this? Your husband signed this 2 years ago. I read the first paragraph, then the second. My hands tightened around the paper. He transferred his interest temporarily. To whom? Susan pointed to the company name. Hale Property Management. I looked at her. Why Daniel believed his father was trying to force him into signing over the house. My heart sank. Then why would Daniel sign anything he didn't know the full structure of the agreement? I read the document again. There were legal terms, clauses, references to debt, and language about collateral. It was designed to confuse anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Susan continued. Daniel realized the problem after the fact. He hired me to investigate. And then he began collecting evidence. She reached into the folder and pulled out a small envelope. My name was written on it, not printed, written by Daniel. I didn't touch it. What is that? He gave it to me 3 weeks before he died. Why he told me to give it to you if Richard tried to take the house. I stared at the envelope. Why didn't you give it to me sooner? Because Daniel told me not to unless Richard made a move. I thought about the hammer, the broken lock. Richard standing in my living room and telling me I had 5 minutes to leave. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Claire, if you're reading this, Dad has finally done what I was afraid he'd do. Don't fight him with anger. Don't threaten him. And don't let him convince you that you're alone. You know more about surviving difficult situations than you think. Trust the paperwork, trust Susan, and trust yourself. I read the note twice. Then I turned it over. There was one final sentence. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I closed my eyes. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Daniel had known. He had been trying to protect me. And somehow, even after he was gone, he was still doing it. Susan quietly said, Claire, there is something else. I opened my eyes. What Daniel recorded a conversation with his father. She placed a small digital recorder on the desk. I pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Daniel answered. It's my house. Our house, Richard said. No, mine and Claire's. There was a long pause. Then Richard said something that made my stomach turn. Claire won't know what to do without you. Daniel's voice became colder. Leave her out of this. I'll do whatever I need to do to protect this family. You mean protect yourself. The recording ended. I sat completely still. Susan watched me. You don't have to decide anything today. I already have. When I looked at the folder, I want every document. You're going to fight him. No. Susan raised an eyebrow. Then what I want him to believe. I'm still the woman he thinks I am. She understood immediately. That afternoon, I went home and found Richard waiting across the street. He was sitting in his truck, watching my house. I parked in the driveway and walked toward him. He lowered the window. You should reconsider your position. What position? The house? I smiled politely. I'll think about it. He seemed surprised you're finally being reasonable. Maybe, he nodded. You've had a difficult week. You don't need more stress. I looked at him. You're right. Then I walked inside. I didn't tell him about Susan. I didn't tell him about the documents. And I certainly didn't tell him that the woman he thought he could intimidate had spent 20 years learning how to remain calm while everyone around her underestimated her. That night, I changed every lock in the house. Then I placed Daniel's note inside my bedside drawer. Before turning off the light, I called Susan. "I want to know everything," I said. "Everything about what my father-in-law." There was a pause. Then Susan said quietly, "Claire, once we start pulling this thread, you may not like what we find." I looked toward the dark hallway. I already know I won't like it. I took a breath. But I need the truth, because Richard thought he had broken into my home to take what belonged to him. He didn't realize he had just opened a door into a past he knew nothing about, and this time I wasn't going to close it. The next morning, Susan called me before I had finished my coffee. "I found something," she said. "What, Daniel's original estate file?" "There's a second set of documents that Richard never knew existed." I set my mug down. "Well, your husband kept them with an attorney in Richmond. I had them transferred here yesterday." I drove to her office immediately. Susan placed the thin folder on the table. "This is the agreement Daniel signed with his father's company." I opened it. "This looks like the same document." "It isn't." She pointed to the final page. "The version Richard has is missing an amendment." I looked closer. The amendment stated that Daniel's interest in the property could not be transferred without my written consent. I stared at the page. "So, Richard can't take the house?" "Not legally. And he knows that I don't think so." I leaned back. For the first time, I understood why Richard had been so aggressive. He wasn't certain he owned the house. He was desperate to make me believe he did. Susan continued, "There's more." She handed me a second document. It was a letter from Daniel. This one was dated 2 months before his death. He had written, "Dad has been pressuring me again. He says Claire won't fight him. He thinks because she doesn't talk much, she doesn't understand what is happening." I read that sentence twice. Then I whispered, "He knew." Susan nodded. "He knew his father underestimated you." I looked at her. "Daniel knew more about me than I thought. He knew enough." That afternoon, I drove to a small veterans center outside town. Thomas Reed was waiting for me. He had known me for nearly 2 decades, not as Claire Hale, as someone from another chapter of my life. He watched me walk through the door and smiled faintly. "You finally decided to stop hiding." "I didn't stop hiding. You came here. I need information." "That sounds more like you." I sat across from him. "Richard is trying to take my house." "I know. He thinks I'm helpless." Thomas leaned back, then let him keep thinking that that was my plan. He smiled. "I knew there was a reason I liked Daniel." I looked down. "Daniel knew about my services." "Not everything." "No." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You really never told his family?" "Never. Not even Richard. Especially not Richard." Thomas nodded. "That man wouldn't know what to do with information like that. He'd use it against me, probably." I looked out the window. "I don't want revenge." Thomas gave me a skeptical look. "I want my home. I want the truth about what Daniel discovered. And I want Richard to understand that he doesn't get to decide what happens to me because his son died." That, Thomas said, sounds a lot like justice. I smiled. "Maybe." That evening, Richard called. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. "Hello." "You've had enough time," he said. "For what?" "To think." "I've been doing a lot of that. The house needs to be handled." "I agree." "Good. I'll handle it." There was a pause. "No, Claire, you don't understand. Daniel's estate belongs to his family. I understand exactly what you're saying. You don't have the resources to fight me." I looked at the folder Susan had given me. "I wouldn't be so sure." His voice hardened. "Don't make this ugly. You brought a hammer to my front door. That was a misunderstanding." "No," I said quietly. "It wasn't." He hung up. The following morning, Mark arrived alone. He stood on my porch with his hands in his pockets. "Can we talk?" I opened the door but didn't invite him inside. "What do you want?" "Dad thinks you're making a mistake." "Your father has made several mistakes." Mark looked uncomfortable. "I know about the documents. That caught my attention." "What documents?" He hesitated. "The ones Dad wants." "You don't know what they are." "I know enough." I studied him. "Then you also know he broke into my house." Mark looked away. "I wasn't supposed to let him do that." "But you did." "I thought he had a right." "Why?" "Because Daniel was his son." I looked at him for a long moment. "Being someone's father doesn't make you their owner." Mark swallowed. "You really think Dad is trying to steal everything?" "I don't think it." I held up the folder. I know it. He looked at the papers. Can I see them? No. Why? Because you haven't told me the truth. His face changed. What truth? What did your father promise you? Silence. That was my answer. Mark finally told me I'd get the business in exchange for what? He didn't answer. Mark. He said if I helped him get control of the property, he'd put me in charge. I felt something sink inside me. So, this was never just about your father? No. You helped him. I didn't know he was going to break the door. But you knew what he wanted. Yes, I nodded. Thank you for telling me. He looked surprised. That's it for now. He walked away. I closed the door. Then I called Susan, Mark confessed. Did he admit anything in writing? No. Then don't rely on it. I won't. There was a pause. Claire. I also found something about the money. What some of those transfers went through Mark's account. I closed my eyes. So the son wasn't just following his father. He was involved. That night Richard sent me a message. Tomorrow morning, 10 we'll settle this. I stared at the screen. Then I typed 3 words. Bring your lawyer. I didn't send anything else. At 10 the next morning, Richard arrived with Mark and an attorney. Richard walked toward my front door and stopped. The new lock was visible. He looked at it. You changed it. Yes. You think a new lock changes anything? I opened the door. It just keeps unwanted people out. His attorney stepped forward. Mrs. Hale, we'd like to resolve this without unnecessary conflict. I looked at him. So would I. Richard handed him a document. This is a formal demand for possession. I didn't take it. Instead, I handed Richard an envelope. He frowned. What is this? You're 24 hours. His face changed. You're threatening me. No. I looked directly into his eyes. I'm giving you one last chance to tell the truth before someone else does. He tore open the envelope. Inside was a copy of the bank records. His face went pale. Mark looked at his father. What did you do? Richard didn't answer. For the first time, the man who had walked into my home with a hammer looked genuinely afraid. His attorney quietly said, Richard, we need to speak privately. Richard stared at me. Who are you? I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the woman he had spent years mocking. The quiet daughter-in-law, the woman he thought he could push aside after his son died. Then I said, someone you should have gotten to know before you decided I was weak. His eyes narrowed, but he still didn't understand. Not yet. 5 minutes later, the attorney asked to see me alone, and when he did, he brought one question that changed everything. Claire, he said, how much do you know about your husband's final investigation? Claire Susan said, how much do you know about your husband's final investigation? I looked at her. Enough to know my father-in-law has been moving money that wasn't his. She nodded. That's only part of it. We were sitting in her office after Richard and his attorney had left. Mark had gone with them, but not before giving me one last look that I couldn't quite read. What else did Daniel find? I asked. Susan opened another file. Your husband believed his father wasn't acting alone. I frowned. Who else, Mark? I already suspected it, but hearing his name still hurt. Daniel thought Mark was helping Richard pressure him into transferring the property. Did Daniel have proof? Susan slid several pages toward me. Emails, bank records, a series of text messages between Richard and Mark. One message from Richard read, once Claire signs, everything becomes simple. Another from Mark said, she'll sign if we give her enough pressure. She's not going to fight us. I stared at those words. Not because they surprised me, because they sounded so much like the man I had known for years. The man who thought being quiet meant being powerless. Susan watched my face. You can take this to the authorities. I know. And you should. I know. But I closed the file. I want them to admit what they did first. Susan studied me. Why? Because Daniel spent his last months trying to understand the truth. I want the truth spoken out loud. She nodded slowly. That makes sense. I left her office just after noon. On the drive home I called Mark. He answered immediately. Claire, we need to talk. About what? Your father. There was silence. What about him? I know about the messages. He stopped breathing for a second. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. His voice dropped. Where did you get them? Get them. From Daniel. Another silence. Then Mark said he wasn't supposed to have those. Neither were you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You helped your father. I thought he was protecting the family. He broke into my house with a hammer. I know. You watched him. I know. I pulled into my driveway. Then tell me the truth. Mark's voice cracked. I was scared of him. That answer surprised me. You're 43 years old. I know, and you're still afraid of your father. You don't understand what he's like. I looked at the broken section of the doorframe, now repaired, but still showing a faint scar. I understand more than you think. Mark was quiet. Then he said Dad told me if I didn't help him, he'd cut me out of everything. And you believed him? Yes. I closed my eyes. That doesn't excuse what you did. I know. Then help me fix it. How? Tell the truth. He didn't answer. Mark, I need time. You've had years. I ended the call that evening. I sat at the kitchen table and opened Daniel's final notebook. Most of the pages were filled with ordinary things. Appointments, bills, notes about the garden, a reminder to replace the garage light. Then I reached the final pages. There was one sentence written across the top. If they come after Claire, she will know what to do. Underneath it, Daniel had written my maiden name. I hadn't seen it written in years. My chest tightened. Daniel had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. He had known that the quiet life I built wasn't the whole story, and he had trusted me to protect it. The next morning, Richard came back. This time he brought his attorney. Mark came too. Richard stood on the sidewalk outside my house. He didn't have a hammer, but he had the same expression, entitlement. I want to settle this today, he said. You're welcome to try. His attorney stepped forward. Mrs. Eisenhale, my client maintains that the property was intended to remain within the Eisenhale family. I handed him a document. Then he should read the original agreement. He looked at it. His expression changed. Richard noticed. What is it? The attorney didn't answer. I looked at Richard. The amendment your son signed was never valid without my consent. Richard's face hardened. That's not possible. It is. You forged that. No. Daniel would never. Daniel did. That stopped him. I continued. He protected my interest in this house because he knew exactly what you were trying to do. Richard looked at Mark. You knew about this? Mark shook his head. No. Richard turned on him. You useless enough. The word came from me. Quietly, but everyone stopped. I had spent years speaking softly because I didn't need to compete with anyone. Now Richard looked at me differently. I stepped closer. You came into my home with a hammer 4 days after your son died. Richard's jaw tightened. You humiliated me. You threatened me. You tried to take my house. It was Daniel's house. It was our house, I said. Then I pointed toward the repaired door. And you broke the lock because you believed nobody would stop you. Richard's attorney looked uncomfortable. I continued. You were wrong. Richard stared at me. You think you're powerful because you have money? No. You think you're powerful because you're my father-in-law? No. Then why? Because I know who I am. He laughed bitterly. You're a housewife. I didn't react. He shook his head. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I looked at him. Neither do you. Thomas was standing beside his car across the street. Richard noticed him. Who is that? Someone who knows me. Richard looked back at me. What exactly did you do before Daniel? I could have answered. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I handed his attorney a final folder. Everything you need is inside. He opened it. Bank transfers, property records, copies of messages, Mark's statements, and a letter from Daniel. The attorney read silently. Richard watched his face. What does it say? The attorney finally looked up. You need to stop. Richard stared at him. What? You need to stop making demands. Richard's face reddened. You work for me. Not if you're asking me to pursue a claim I now know has no legal basis. Mark looked at his father. Dad. Richard turned toward him. You betrayed me. Mark shook his head. No. I finally stopped lying for you. The words seemed to hit Richard harder than anything I had said. He stepped toward his son. Mark didn't move. For the first time, Richard looked old. Not powerful, not frightening, just old. A man who had spent so long controlling everyone around him that he didn't know what to do when they stopped obeying. He looked at me. You planned all of this? No. You knew what would happen. I knew what I would do if you crossed the line. He stared at me. Who taught you that I thought about 20 years of service, about people who had taught me discipline, patience, and the value of preparation? Then I looked at the broken lock. You don't need to know. Richard's attorney quietly gathered the documents. We're leaving. Richard didn't move. Finally, he turned toward me. You're not who I thought you were. No, I said. I never was. He walked away. I watched him reach the truck. Then Mark stopped beside me. Claire. I turned. I'm sorry, I nodded. I believe you, his eyes filled with tears, but I don't know if I can forgive myself. That part is yours to work through. He nodded. Then he left. I went inside. The house was quiet again. I stood beside the repaired door and ran my hand over the new lock. 5 minutes. That was all it had taken for Richard to believe he could take my home. 5 minutes was also all it had taken for him to discover that the woman he thought was weak had been preparing for difficult moments her entire life. But I knew something Richard didn't. Winning the fight wasn't the same as healing from it. And before this story ended, I would have to decide what justice meant when the person who hurt me was still family. 3 months after Richard walked away from my house, the new lock was still there. I had thought about replacing the entire door. Instead, I kept it, not because I wanted a reminder of what happened, because I wanted a reminder of what I had learned. The broken lock had been repaired. The wood had been sanded and refinished. From the street, nobody would ever know someone had once stood there with a hammer convinced he had the right to take my home. But I knew. And sometimes knowing was enough. The legal process took longer than any of us expected. Richard's attorney withdrew after reviewing the financial records. The bank opened an investigation into the transfers from Eleanor's estate. Mark agreed to cooperate and provided copies of messages and emails that confirmed what Daniel had suspected. The truth was finally coming out. Richard had convinced himself that everything he did was for the family. He had used that sentence for years. For the family. When he pressured Daniel. For the family. When he moved money. For the family. When he tried to take my house. For the family. But eventually the phrase became impossible to believe. The money was returned. The property issue was resolved. And the house remained mine. There was no dramatic courtroom victory. No judge pounding a gavel while Richard was dragged away. Real life rarely works that neatly. There were lawyers, documents, phone calls, waiting periods, and uncomfortable conversations. And there were consequences. Richard had to repay what he could and surrender control over several financial accounts. Mark had to face his own responsibility. He wasn't innocent just because he had been afraid of his father. Fear could explain a choice. It couldn't erase it. I told him that when he came to see me one afternoon, we sat on the back porch. He looked exhausted. I keep thinking about that day, he said. The day your father broke the door. Yes. He stared at his hands. I should have stopped him. You should have. He nodded. I was scared. I know. I thought if I went against him, I'd lose everything. I looked at him. You almost did. He swallowed. I know. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said Daniel would hate what we became. I looked out at the garden. He would hate what happened. But I don't think he would want us to stay broken forever. Mark wiped his eyes. I miss him. So do I. That was the first honest thing we had shared in months. No excuses, no arguments, just grief. A few weeks later, Richard called me. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Hello. His voice sounded different, smaller. Claire. Could I come by? I looked at the clock. When? Tomorrow. All right. He arrived the next afternoon without Mark. He stood on the porch for several seconds before knocking. When I opened the door, he looked at the new lock. I see you kept it. I did. He nodded. I deserve that. I didn't answer. He took a breath. I owe you an apology. Yes. He looked surprised. I don't know what I expected you to say. I don't either. He lowered his eyes. I was wrong about you. That wasn't your biggest mistake. He looked up. What was you thought love gave you ownership? His face tightened. I continued. You thought because Daniel was your son, you had a right to control his decisions. You thought because was his wife, I was someone you could push aside. Richard looked toward the driveway. I was afraid. Of what? Losing my family. I said nothing. He continued. After Eleanor died, everything changed. Then Daniel stopped listening to me. Mark started pulling away. I felt like I was losing control of everything. His voice broke slightly, so I tried to hold on tighter, and you squeezed until everyone wanted to get away. He nodded. Yes. For the first time, I saw the man underneath the anger. Not the bully, not the man with the hammer. Just an aging father who had confused control with love until he couldn't tell the difference anymore. I can't forget what you did, I said. I know. I can't pretend it didn't happen. I know. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life hating you. He looked at me. Does that mean you forgive me? I thought about it. Yes, his eyes filled, but forgiveness comes with boundaries. He nodded. You won't come into my home without permission. I won't. You won't interfere with my finances. I won't. And if you ever threaten me again, there won't be another conversation. I understand. That was our reconciliation. Not a hug. Clears throat. Not some perfect family reunion. Just two people finally understanding where the line was. And sometimes I think that is what real reconciliation looks like. Not pretending nothing happened. Not forgetting. Not allowing someone to hurt you again. Just choosing not to carry the anger forever. Several months later, I finally told my daughter the truth about my past. She was sitting with me at the kitchen table. Mom, she said. Why you ever tell me? I smiled. Because I wanted you to know me before you knew my history. She thought about that. Were you really in the Navy for 20 years? Yes. Were you scared? Sometimes. She looked surprised. I thought people like you weren't scared. I laughed softly. Everyone gets scared. Then what makes someone strong? I looked toward the front door. The ability to stay calm enough to make the right decision anyway. She nodded. That answer meant more to me than any story I could tell her about my past. Because the most important lesson from everything that happened wasn't that I had served in the military. It wasn't that I knew how to protect myself. It wasn't even that I had defeated Richard in the end. It was that strength doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes, strength looks like staying silent instead of shouting. Sometimes it looks like calling a lawyer instead of making a threat. Sometimes it means keeping copies of important documents, understanding your property rights, having a will, reviewing beneficiary designations, and knowing exactly what happens to your finances when someone dies. And sometimes strength means saying, I forgive you, while still saying, you will never cross that line again. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, let it be this. Don't assume you know what someone is capable of because of how quietly they live. Don't confuse kindness with weakness. And if you're dealing with an estate after losing someone you love, don't rely on verbal promises or family pressure. Get the paperwork, talk to a qualified attorney. Understand ownership, beneficiary designations, wills, trusts, and your state's probate rules before signing anything. Family should never be an excuse to ignore boundaries, and love should never be used as a weapon. Daniel's photograph still sits on my living room shelf. Sometimes I look at it and wish he had lived long enough to see everything unfold. Then I remember his note. Trust yourself. I finally understand what he meant. He wasn't telling me to become the woman I used to be. He was reminding me that I never stopped being her. The quiet woman, the wife, the mother, the woman who spent 20 years serving her country. They were all me. And none of those versions needed to prove anything to anyone. I walked to the front door that evening and touched the new lock. Then I smiled. The old lock had been broken because someone thought my home belonged to him. The new one stayed closed because I finally understood something important. A boundary isn't a wall built out of anger. It's a door you control. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is decide who gets to walk through it. If this story reminded you of someone who stayed strong when others underestimated them, share it with them. And if you've ever had to choose between revenge and peace, I'd love to hear what you would have done. Sometimes the hardest victories aren't the ones where we defeat someone else. They're the ones where we refuse to let someone else's cruelty change who we are. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and remember, you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the strongest. Sometimes quiet strength speaks for itself.